Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
Hey everybody, welcome to this special bonus episode of MindShift Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Dr. Clint Haycock, coming to you from The Rock here in North Wales on a sunny Saturday morning. I've been doing a lot of thinking on this subject of this movie, A Thief in the Night. I wrote an article recently on medium.com that you can take a look at. In fact, what I'll do is I'll put a link to it in the show notes, where I talked about an experience when I was 12 years old, or so thereabouts, 12, 13, somewhere around there. When I came home by myself from soccer practice, or football as we say here in Britain, but I came home from practice and there was nobody home, and I panicked because I thought that everyone had been raptured. All my family was gone. My parents, all my older sisters were not in the house, and I freaked out and was absolutely terrified that I had been left behind. And this is also something that I talked about on a recent podcast with Chris Shelton on his Sensibly Speaking podcast. You can look that up on YouTube as well if you want to see the live recording of that, as Chris and I were talking about my upbringing in fundamentalist Christianity, growing up in the Bill Gothard cult. And someone asked me on Twitter to do a little bit more unpacking of this movie, A Thief in the Night, and kind of talk about what's behind it. I've been listening to a hilarious takedown of the movie. Actually, there's actually 4 movies in the series. A Thief in the Night, A Distant Thunder, I think is the next film. There's actually 4 movies that go on, and this is on the God Awful Movies podcast that they do these really hilarious mockeries of really bad Christian movies. So they do all 4 of these films. And basically the plot of these movies is it follows some people who don't believe, they're not Christians, and when the rapture occurs, which is kind of the beginning point of the movie, they actually are left behind. All the Christians are taken up into heaven. They just suddenly vanish. They disappear right in the middle of whatever they were doing, driving a car, flying a plane, baking cookies, whatever it was, and they just vanish, and the whole world descends into chaos. It descends into what the Bible refers to in the book of Revelations as the 7 years of tribulation, and it's this terrible one world government and the Antichrist and the beast, and there's Armageddon. And if you're familiar at all with any of the sort of basic plot line of the book of Revelation, then you'll be familiar with it. But what got me to thinking about how to approach this topic was I was listening to Chris Shelton's Sensibly Speaking podcast on the way to work. I've got about an hour's drive each way to work, where I work at a college here in the UK. I teach carpentry and joinery. And so this is a perfect opportunity to put a podcast on. Most of them are around an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. So that's almost perfect for my journey to and from work. So here I was listening to Chris Shelton's podcast, and he had a guy on there who was a survivor of the Bill Gothard cult, like I was, only his family was way more into it than ours was. He was fully homeschooled in the ATI, what they call the Advanced Training Institute, the Bill Gothard sort of curriculum for homeschooling. They used to go every summer to, I think it was Chattanooga, Tennessee, to a huge conference. It was like a week-long conference with all these Gothardites from all over the country. There might be, 10, 15,000 people bringing their families, and they would hear Gothard preach and everything like that all throughout the week. So he was way more into it. We never did any of those things. In our household, it was basically a case of our parents raising us according to the Gothard principles. And one thing that struck me about it as I was listening to him describe it, it's basically a mini cult. That's really what it is. If you go back and look at it in the context of, for example, Robert Lifton's 8 Markers of Cults, or Stephen Hassan's BITE model, behavior, information, thought, and emotional control. That's how cults and cult leaders are able to exercise control over their followers. Basically, as Robert Lifton describes it, it's all about milieu control. In other words, the context. So you look at your mini cult sort of family model. Your parents are the cult leaders, if you will, and they are ascribing to, for example, in this case, the Bill Gothard teaching. And what they're doing is they're creating a little mini cult using Gothard's teachings. So if we unpack it, for example, using Stephen Hassan's BITE model, this is how the whole thing kind of functions. We start off with the B in the model, behavior control, which is enforced by spankings and severe discipline, things like that. You've got information control. So in the case of myself and so many others, we were sheltered from the world. We were not allowed to read certain books. We didn't have a television. And you can hear stories about people who, even if they did have a television, their watching time was severely curtailed. They could not watch certain shows. They could not read Harry Potter. This is what this guy was talking about. He used to sneak out and go hide in the caravan, the trailer out in the barn, and hide his Harry Potter books, and he would read them secretly out there because it was forbidden literature. And if he was found out, of course, he would have gotten in trouble. He would have gotten spanked. So these are ways to control information to protect us ostensibly from the world. But that was the aim of it, was information control. And then, of course, thought control. You have this idea of you have to be self-policing. It's not enough to just have someone think for you and tell you what to do. The goal, of course, is to get you, the follower or the family member, to be self-policing. And the reason why thought control is so important in this context, in this milieu control, is that bad thoughts, of course, could be a sin against God too. So you have to be aware. You have to guard your mind. So this is really, really important. The realm of the mind is critically important. And of course, emotional control, ways to suppress emotions. There are ways, and this is part of getting involved in your local church. This is all about this emotional control, singing, worship, praying. These are ways that help people to stuff their emotions in a way. You might come into the church service feeling bad, but the fervor of the worship lifts you up, and it helps you to suppress the bad feelings that you have. And it's kind of a religious addiction. You want to keep coming back week in and week out. It's kind of like a spiritual high, just like that drug user. They can never seem to recapture the very first high that they had on whatever drug they were using. And you're always chasing that high. You're also always chasing those emotional experiences, those high mountaintop experiences. I can remember as a kid having them at summer camp. And so to deal with the bad feelings, which ironically the religion itself has laid on the follower, you've got to then come back and have God help you to recover from the shitty week that you just had and all the guilt and shame that the preacher's about to lay on you. Now, I don't want to get too much into the cult conversation. If you want to find out more about some of these issues of how evangelicalism specifically resembles in many ways the world of the cults, I've done a couple of bonus episodes and some podcasts on this actually, so you can look those up. Now, how does all this, though, relate to getting back to our topic of this movie, A Thief in the Night, and how it specifically engenders rapture anxiety? Let's take a minute, let's back up a bit and take a look at this topic of child rearing. I think that's where we need to start, establish a baseline, and then we'll move on into actually deconstructing and critically analyzing the movie as well as its interpretation of the Bible. Let's take a few minutes and talk about different child rearing strategies, because it occurred to me as I was hearing this guy talk about his experience growing up in the Gothard cult was that you have, let's say, your sort of classic Christian parents, and let's compare them to, let's say, a non-religious family. And I know I'm grossly oversimplifying. There's a million different philosophies on child rearing. But if you look, for example, at, let's say, your typical sort of non-religious household where the parents don't have any real strong religious beliefs, they're not religious. I'm not saying they're atheist or agnostic or anything like that. They just don't have a religion. And they might think about raising their kids in a way that encourages them to explore their own spirituality. For them, okay, yeah, they understand the kid has, as he or she is growing up, we want to encourage and develop their personality. Every person is different and unique, aren't they? But for, let's say, the more secular parents, they might, give the child free rein to explore and find their own path, so to speak. And this is a major difference when you compare that sort of philosophy to your classic evangelical or fundamentalist philosophy of child rearing, because they, of course, would probably agree, I think, that children definitely have unique personality traits. I remember growing up as a kid and hearing Dr. James Dobson talking about the different personality types. I don't know if you remember this at all, but you had, I think, choleric, sanguine, melancholy, and one other, I can't remember, but that was kind of his classification. You find out which sort of personality type am I, and that describes me. I'm a sanguine, I'm a melancholy, I'm a choleric, or whatever. And they would probably get into things like the Myers-Briggs test and help you understand your personality and help to encourage that. But of course, right off the bat, we have to keep in mind that for the Christian parent, they're looking at it as your personality and your spiritual gifts, as they call them, are gifts from God. And they are meant to serve the church. So all those spiritual gifts that you read about in places like 1 Corinthians 12, for example, Paul says, all gifts are given for the service of the church. And so your personality, the kind of person that God made you to be, if you will, that's meant to serve the church. That's meant to do something to help further the aims, the mission, the goals of your local church that you're heavily involved in. So right off the bat, we have a major difference between the worldview or the paradigm of the more secularist or non-religious parent versus the Christian parent. So we can see right away there's a major difference, isn't there, in just the sort of orientation between the Christian parent and the more secular parent who might be trying to raise their children in such a way that it allows them to develop their own personality and seek their own sort of spiritual path as well and see where that takes them. For the Christian parents, they're going to start out with some very serious presuppositions already in mind. In other words, their first starting point is they believe that that child, when he or she is born, that kid is born into sin. He or she is already headed to hell. Because of Adam and Eve's sin way back in the Garden of Eden, that child is bound for hell. And so that then sets up a completely different trajectory, a different path for the quote-unquote godly parents who are trying to raise their child, because they're really, I think, their first and primary goal, their orientation is, we need to make sure that this child gets saved and ends up in heaven. That is our mandate as godly parents. God himself requires us as parents to make sure that, first of all, the child ends up getting saved. So we've got to try and make sure that happens. Now, of course, they're going to admit that it's not up to them to save the child. That's between them and God. But they're going to do everything in their power to place the child in the right context, in the right setting. So that's why it's so important to be in church from day one, to make sure the kid goes to Sunday school, youth group, and all those other great, godly, wonderful activities, or even homeschool or Christian school. We got to protect that kid from the evils of the world. And then the other element of it is, because the child is born into sin, according to their theological interpretation of the Bible, that then becomes their worldview. That means that he or she already has a proclivity to rebel against God and to rebel against their parents. And so as parents, your goal, as Christian parents, your goal is to discipline the child in a way that makes sure that it breaks their proclivity to sin. This is something that people like Bill Gothard, even James Dobson, I was doing a bit of reading on the Focus on the Family website this morning, and they get into this issue of, is it biblical to spank a child? Should you spank a child? And they kind of skirt around the issue. They do acknowledge that there are problems associated with spanking, as it can roll over into abuse very easily, and it can be psychologically damaging. But of course, it's funny, as I read through the articles on the Focus on the Family, they always keep coming back to this issue of, but it's mandated in the Bible. They can't get away from that. And so their view, and people like Michael and Debbie Pearl, I was doing a bit of reading on their website as well. They go all the way back to when the kid's a toddler, you should swat them with a little spoon or a little rod on the hand when they're as young as, 5-6 months old. You shouldn't spank a kid that young, but there's that physical pain that's associated with disobedience. And there's another element to this too, where not only is God, holding that parent responsible, God will bless them if they do the right things, and he will punish them too if they do the wrong things, by which I mean not spanking, not training up the child. And they have all these verses. Most of them are from Proverbs, the sort of spare the rod, spoil the child sort of verses. The most famous one, I think, that I hear all over the place, and I see it on these different websites, is the proverb that says, train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. And they see that as not just good sage advice, which of course is ironic because the book of Proverbs is exactly that. There's a bunch of crazy proverbs in there too, but somehow they've picked these ones out and they've said, these are biblical mandates. These are commands. These are imperatives from God. You have to spank a child, and that's part of this training and discipline. And that is your sort of requirement as a Christian parent. You have to train up that child. And when he or she gets older, they won't depart from the faith. They will be a staunch believer. And of course, into this, we could roll things like the purity culture as well, because Not only are you making sure that child gets saved by keeping them in church, keeping them involved in church activities, youth group, and Sunday school as they grow up. This is all part of the training and the spanking and the discipline, the context of your home life. That's all part of it as well. It's all part of this milieu control, going back to Robert Lifton's model. And the purity culture fits into that too, which is one of the markers of cults that he talks about, the demand for purity. Because as a parent, your goal, as a Christian parent, I should say, your goal is to deliver a virginal son or daughter to the wedding altar. And again, they sort of treat the child as a commodity. If you, the parent, can deliver that child to the altar on his or her wedding day as a virgin, having gone through all the purity pledges and purity rings and all that stuff, this sort of purity culture in the evangelical church, not only will God bless that newly married couple, both of whom are virgins, but he will also bless you, the parent. So you get like a bonus out of the deal as well. They get blessed and you get blessed as well because you successfully delivered, as it were, the product to market, the virginal son or daughter to the wedding altar. You can walk away with your head held high and say, I did all the right things. Therefore, God will shower some blessings on you as well. So this is kind of how this whole worldview sort of operates. Completely different, isn't it, from, let's say, the more secular parenting model. They're not going to believe that the kid is born into sin, he or she is headed for hell, and all these things are immediately apparent straight off the bat in their child-rearing philosophy. So for the Christian parents, going back now, I'll explain how this relates to, as I see them showing movies like A Thief in the Night to young children like myself and many others, thousands, tens of thousands of people who saw the film as I did, probably in the late 70s, early 80s. I think the film came out in 72, I want to say, and it was a very traumatic experience. And it was actually marketed. It was not marketed to be released in theaters. It was actually meant expressly, specifically to be shown in churches on ideally a Sunday night sort of service. And I can remember dimly this thing was being built up because back in the 70s, we didn't go see many movies just anyway, full stop. My parents, of course, being good fundamentalists, they wanted to shelter us from the world. The only movies that we saw in theaters were things like Walt Disney movies. So we were allowed to go see those kind of family fun films when we were kids, and so there was this hype. Hey, we're going to have a movie night at the church coming up in 3 Sundays from now or whatever, A Thief in the Night. Wow, this is going to be a cool, fun event for the whole family. Bring the whole family. The place was full. The church was packed out, and they showed us this movie, and I was about 10 or so when I saw it, I think, for the first time in the mid-70s. So this was hyped up as a big event. And then a couple of months later, well, maybe not even a couple of months, I think it might have been a couple of weeks later, while the church still had the actual movie, because keep in mind, this is in the 70s, we had an actual film projector. The church had one. Every church kind of had one of these film projectors, and you'd roll the film through the projector, and it would play, just like in a movie theater, on the big screen. This was before DVDs and, online. There was no such thing as the internet, so we couldn't stream anything. So that's how they did it. My dad borrowed the projector. He borrowed the film, brought it home. We put up a big white sheet in our living room, and they showed it again to their kind of home group, their home Bible study group. So I watched it again just a week or two later, and so that message was reinforced. Okay, so let's now go back and relate what I've been saying about the two different sort of parenting models. How does that relate to this issue of this movie, A Thief in the Night? Let's put it in that context. This is how I'm seeing it now. I see it in the way of, okay, for my parents, that mandate that I, as a baby boy, when I was born, I was already headed for hell. I was born into sin. That meant that I was going to be naturally rebellious, naturally naughty, and that was just simply a result of my sin nature, me acting out and doing the wrong things. But it was more than that. It was that I needed to be saved. And so as parents, especially fundamentalist parents, they would have seen this opportunity to show a 10-year-old kid this horrific movie. And I give my parents a little bit of credit, and probably a lot of parents too. I'm not letting them off the hook, but I will say that, they hadn't pre-screened the movie. If I as a parent, I've got 2 daughters, I would, if there was a movie that looked to be even mildly frightening, I wouldn't show them, the Saw movies when they were 9 or 10, year old girls. I would make sure I'd watch it first, I'd pre-screen it, and I'd probably have this discussion with my wife, and we'd say, there's no way in hell that a 10-year-old kid should be watching a horror film, which is essentially what A Thief in the Night was. It was Christian horror. And essentially, basically, that's what it was. So we would say, no, not a good idea. Now, my parents didn't do that. They just took the pastor at his word. They brought the whole family and we watched the movie. So they should have been a little bit more diligent in terms of being, better parents. But of course, from their point of view, this is what I'm getting at with my analogy of the child rearing thing, is that for them, it would have been absolutely critically important that we watch the movie. If it meant that we were going to be scared into salvation and thereby go on into heaven, then happy days. They've done their job. They would say, hey, look, man, a little bit of trauma for the kid is good. It's going to scare him. It's going to scare her. It's going to wake them up. It's going to sober them up to the reality of what's going to happen. And of course, they would have believed in the message of the film. They bought into the theology of the movie. And so for them, they would have said, yeah, absolutely. Okay, it's a little bit scary. But again, this is serious stuff here, because for these Christian fundamentalist parents, they're saying, listen, eternity's on the line. Everything is at stake here. This child of mine, I don't want to see them go to hell. I don't want to see them consigned to the flames of hell for eternity. And if it meant that me showing them this movie was what turned them around and got them to go, whoa, I don't want to have that happen to me. I don't want to get left behind. I want to make sure I'm one of those people that gets raptured out. I don't want to face the tribulation. I don't want to get executed with a guillotine in front of everybody because I didn't take the mark of the beast, and I probably won't get into heaven even then, so it's too late. When the rapture occurs, not if, but when, and you've missed it, it's tough luck for you. You've now got to face the 7 years of tribulation. And this is a very critical point, that in the theology of the movie, those who got left behind, who didn't get taken up into heaven in the rapture, they essentially fall into two classes. One, of course, is your classic non-believer, those who were never Christians. But then, significantly, the other group of people that get left behind are those who don't believe the correct things about Jesus and about God. Therefore, they were not true Christians. Even liberal Christians get left behind in the theology of the film. And those two words, left behind, those are picked up in the famous song by Larry Norman. It's called I Wish We'd All Been Ready, and that was featured in the movie. Now listen to the lyrics from this song by Larry Norman. It goes, life was filled with guns and war, and all of us got trampled on the floor. I wish we'd all been ready. The children died, the days grew cold. A piece of bread could buy a bag of gold. I wish we'd all been ready. There's no time to change your mind. The Son has come, that's the Son of God, and you've been left behind. A man and wife asleep in bed. She hears a noise and turns her head. He's gone. I wish we'd all been ready. Two men walking up a hill. One disappears and one's left standing still. I wish we'd all been ready. The Father spoke, that is God. The demons dined. How could you have been so blind? There's no time to change your mind. The Son has come and you've been left behind. There's no time to change your mind. The Son has come and you've been left behind. I hope we'll all be ready. You've been left behind. And that's the lyrics to Larry Norman's famous song that's featured in the first movie, I Wish We'd All Been Ready. And it was a huge song. I remember singing that song in church after the film had been played. That was one of the songs that we regularly sang as part of the worship rotation after this movie. So you think about the lyrics and the theology of that song. It's too late to change your mind. The Son of God has come. Everyone's that's a true Christian has been raptured away, and it's too late. I wish we'd all been ready. And that's the theology of the movie. Now, let's take a minute to think about how the actual movie functioned, because as I listened to the hilarious takedown of the films on god-awful movies, it struck me that it goes back to this issue of narratology. Now, this is something I studied in my PhD thesis. I did a thesis on the book of Ezekiel, and I was trying to relate it to sort of narrative styles of preaching. This is back when I was just on the tail end of still being an evangelical Christian. I really wanted to help people, preachers that is, get a better approach to preaching difficult texts. So the book of Ezekiel is one of the most difficult texts in the whole Bible to interpret and understand. I thought, well, nobody's going to touch the book of Ezekiel anyway. I'm an Old Testament guy. I studied Hebrew. That's what I did for my MA thesis. And so I thought I'll be well positioned. I was really passionate about helping the church. And that is why, incidentally, my website is still called The Preacher's Forum. This podcast originally started out, it was called the Preacher's Forum. And it's funny because one of my Patreon supporters asked me the other day, she said, was your podcast called something different? Because I've been listening to some of the earlier episodes from a couple of years ago when you first started, and you're talking about the Preacher's Forum. What is that? What does that even mean? And I said, yeah, that was back when I was still kind of trying to give it one last big effort. I was really hoping that I could turn things around for the church and give them a more sort of a dialogical preaching model that would help engage people rather than just, standing up there telling them what to think, telling them what to do, explaining what the Bible says. I wanted to come up with a preaching model that helped people to think and, open up discussion and dialogue, and we could actually have a discussion around how the Bible is interpreted and what does it mean and all that. But anyway, that's all in the past. But I'm still kind of stuck with the name because that's my podcast hosting space, and that's what iTunes picks up from, when it gets on iTunes. I have to post it on my website. So it's a funny kind of remnant from my evangelical Christian past, and I'm still kind of stuck with. I'm not really sure what to do about it, but that's what it is. Anyway, so that was the Preacher's Forum. But anyway, going back to this issue of narratology, as I was studying the book of Ezekiel, I got more and more into the study of narratology. And that is basically, if you've never heard of it, narratology is the study of how narrative texts actually work. How does a story function to get its point across? There's things like plot and setting and dialogue and characters, characterization, how a character is portrayed. And this is sort of this inductive Bible study approach that I used to use when I was studying the text, but I went way more into it and I got really deeply into it. Now, the thing about narratology is you got to understand when an author writes a piece of narrative, okay, they're going to sit down and tell a story, right? What they're doing is what they call creating a world or creating a universe. So, for example, you can think of things like Narnia. That's not a real place, is it? But C.S. Lewis created a world. He created the world of Narnia. And as a reader, you enter into this fictional world of Narnia. Or let's say, for example, Tolkien created Middle-earth. That's not a real place. It's a fictional place, but that's the universe. That's the world that Tolkien created. And so as a reader, what you do is you enter into the narrative world that the author creates. And that's sort of how narratives function. And you have to kind of go into it, suspend your disbelief, as the saying goes. Because obviously, there's no such thing as Narnia. You can go in the back of a wardrobe and try to find Narnia. But I guarantee that no matter how much poking around you do in the back of your wardrobe or your closet, you're not going to be able to go through and enter Narnia. There is no such place as Narnia. But you, as the reader, you have to, obviously it's fictional, but you have to enter into that world. And then, of course, what the author does is he or she populates their world with characters, and there's events that happen, and you enter into that story. You've set yourself into that narrative world, and you sort of walk in the shoes of the characters. And that's what the study of narratology, in a very brief way, is all about. Essentially, then, the study of narratology is all about how did the author create that world? How does he or she move the plot along? What characters are in there? What sort of things happen? How does it make us as readers feel? What do we experience as we walk with the characters and live through vicariously in a way their experiences? And again, we're in that world. We've entered that fictional world that the author has created. And so let's relate that now to A Thief in the Night. So here's how this thing works. You've got a guy, his name is Russell S. Doughten Jr. It's spelled D-O-U-G-H-T-E-N. He was born in 1927. He passed away in August of 2013. Okay, he was an American filmmaker. He was an absolute fundamentalist. He made those 4 movies, and I think I mentioned that there were 4 movies. The first one was A Thief in the Night, which came out in 1972. Followed by A Distant Thunder, 1978. Then came The Image of the Beast, 1980. And finally, The Prodigal Planet in 1983. In fact, this is a funny piece of Thief in the Night trivia. He actually appears in all 4 movies. He appears as a certain Reverend Matthew Turner. He's like this preacher turned survivalist. Now, what's interesting about him is, of course, in the movie, this preacher, he's a liberal preacher. And so he doesn't believe he's preaching in church and all that, but of course he's a liberal, so he doesn't qualify as a true believer. He gets left behind in the rapture, and then he kind of turns into this survivalist guy who starts really researching the end times. He comes up with this end times chart and it shows all the bowls and seals and all the things that are going to happen in the end time. And so this is what Doughton himself appears in the film as sort of a cameo role, Reverend Matthew Turner. But anyway, Doughton, of course, he's a fundamentalist. So he's looking at the text, he's reading the book of Revelation, and it's not just the book of Revelation. There are other apocalyptic texts in the Bible. Ezekiel, for example, has stuff about Armageddon at the end of the book. There's things in Jude, there's Zechariah, Daniel. So you got to go through the whole Bible and kind of pick out these end time sort of prophecies and apocalyptic sort of literature. And so this is what Doughton does. Now he's going to approach the text. He's going to say, as a fundamentalist, I'm going to approach it in a literalist reading perspective. And of course, as a fundamentalist, he's also going to buy into the inspiration, inerrancy, infallibility, authority of the Bible. That's why it's so important. And in fact, all throughout all the movies, there's always a character in there or multiple characters that are always preaching the gospel to certain other characters in the film. But this is what's called the ostensible audience. In other words, in the narratological way of looking at it, yes, one character is preaching the gospel to another in the film. That's the ostensible audience of the message. But the real audience is you, the viewer, because you're listening to it. And going back to Larry Norman's song, now there's time to change your mind before the sun has come. So really what Doughton is doing is he's using the character to preach directly to the viewer of the film. And of course now it's all true according to the movie, because clearly the rapture has happened, and that therefore proves everything literally true from the Bible. So again, we've bought into that world of the movie if you in fact enter in to the fictional world that Russell S. Doughton created. These are describing literal events that are going to occur. And so essentially the narrative world that Doughton created for the movie is this scenario as he's interpreting the Bible, and specifically really the book of Revelation. But as I say, there are other apocalyptic texts both in the Old as well as the New Testament. So he's going to draw on all these things to put his sort of theology together. And this is really the important point that I want to make. When I was a kid, when I was 10, 11 years old, watching these movies and growing up all the way into the 80s, they kept popping up everywhere. They showed them one summer at Christian summer camp. It was like for a while there, I couldn't get away from these fucking movies. They were all over the place. They were being shown everywhere. And every time it was repeating the trauma. But of course, I didn't have the critical thinking faculties, that filter to step back. Now that I'm an adult, now that I've studied narratology and I can see how it works, I can of course look at a film like that and say, well, of course, it's a fictional world. It's a world that Doughton created, a scenario that he believes it's based on a literal reading of the Bible. And then he's saying, now let's watch it play out in these 4 movies, following the lives of these people that get left behind in the rapture and what happens to them. But I couldn't see that. I just entered into it. There was no disbelief to suspend. I just looked at the films, watched them, and said, my God, this is true. This is real. This is what's going to happen. And I didn't have that critical faculty to step back, to zoom out a little bit and say, well, that's just his interpretation. And they certainly didn't say after the movie. It would have been helpful for our pastor to stand up after the movie and have a group discussion. Say, okay, people, now this is something I studied in Bible college and seminary. The pastor could have said, now listen, let's step back and let's have sort of a decompression discussion here. Let's talk about the theology of the movie. I learned in Bible college and seminary there's at least 4 different views on the end times. Pre-tribulational rapture, mid-tribulational rapture, post-tribulational rapture, where they believe Christ is going to come back and all the Christians have to endure the 7 years. So they're not whisked away, as Doughton says at the beginning, and then then tribulation falls. And then there's this amillennialist view, which basically says we're not going to interpret any of it literally. We don't think it's apocalyptic literature. You can't interpret it literally. So you're assigning dates and you're putting end time charts together. The end is just going to come gradually, and then that's going to be it. So there are completely different views among Christians, at least 4, probably more subsets within those 4. They're going to disagree. And he could have said to us, now listen, this view is the first one. It's a pre-tribulational rapture. It's based on dispensational theology, which basically holds that God works throughout history in various dispensations. There was the period of law in the Old Testament. And then when Christ came, that now we have the dispensation of grace. We're in the church age. And then there's going to be this dispensation of the end times. And there's sort of these chunks and periods of dispensations where God acts in different ways and he treats his people differently based on whether it's law or grace or end times. And so this is the approach that a guy like Dotton is going to have. He's going to take it literally. He's going to take it in this sort of dispensational way. Now that would have been helpful even as a 10-year-old kid to have him say, listen, guys and gals, that's not the only view. There are other views. Let's step back and look at this a little bit more objectively. That would have been a more pastoral thing to do. That would have been super helpful even as a 10-year-old, but that wasn't it. It was presented, as I say, as this is reality. This is a future vision of what is going to happen exactly as it's laid out. So you, as the young child watching the movie, you don't know that, and no one tells you that. You're just presented this narrative world that you enter into, and it's true and it's real, and that's what it is. And so this is basically, I guess, what I wanted to say about the film is that how does it function from a narratological point of view? This is what Dotton has done. And when you start look at it from that point of view, you say, okay, let's analyze it objectively. That's just one man's approach and one man's interpretation of a very problematic and difficult text. I can remember when I was in Bible college, I took my last semester there in my 4th year, we took a class, ecclesiology and eschatology. Now, ecclesiology is the study of the church. Eschatology is the study of the end times. And one of the things that the professor had us all do was our last assignment, our big project was to create an end times chart based on all those apocalyptic texts that I was talking about, Daniel, Jude, Zechariah, Ezekiel, Revelation, all those places that mention anything to do with the rapture or the end times or how it's going to work. The end of Matthew, Jesus talks about this. So there's a lot of verses, a lot of places in the Bible. Now, I spent days and days and days studying, going through all this, reading commentaries. I ended up putting together a chart. I think it was about 6 regular pieces of paper. I taped them together. I made a giant timeline. I think Russell S. Dotson would be proud of me, although I disagreed with his view. But I still came up with a pre-tribulational view. So I guess I'd be in line with Dotton at that point. But I tried to put all these things together. And one of the things I noticed, even though I was a staunch evangelical and I was preparing for ministry and I was super into it because I had come out of that world of biblical prophecy and all this sort of end time stuff. So I thought, I'm really going to get into this here. I'm going to solve this for once and for all. I had a 6-page chart that was taped to the wall. I turned it in. I did get an A on the assignment. The professor said he'd never seen anything so thorough. I had every possible verse in the Bible and probably a lot that didn't fit. But one of the things I noticed right away was as you're reading through the book of Revelation, and this is the problem with apocalyptic literature, just as a genre, sometimes it reads fairly literally. It starts out, for example, the book of Revelation, there's these sort of letters to these 7 churches around Asia Minor, and they're real places. They're, addressing churches that were planted by people like Paul and the other early apostles in that time in the 1st century. And, God is telling John, the apostle John, who's been exiled on the island of Patmos, and this is where he receives allegedly this vision of the book of Revelation. And he's going through, and it seems like, okay, I can track with this. There's some specific grievances here. Some of these churches are doing well. Some of them are having issues and problems that need to be addressed. And you're like, okay, this makes sense. These are historical churches that existed in time and space. You can go there to this day, and these cities exist, Laodicea and Thessalonica and places like that. But then it starts getting weird, and you go along and the book kind of functions like that. There'll be a chapter or two that seems like it's chronologically sort of advancing. This happens, then this happens, the 7 bowls of judgment, the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, one right after the other. And that's real easy. You can just lay those down and say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then the next series of judgments comes and each one of them gets successively worse. Okay, that's simple. You can just, plot those in a timeline. But then all of a sudden there's a chapter or two that's just, the moon comes down and it's a woman and there's a dragon that comes out of the sea with 10 horns. And you're just like, whoa, what the hell? Flying grasshoppers and scorpions. What does that mean? And this is where a guy like Dotton really struggled. And it's where I struggled too in my end times chart, because the problem with the whole thing is you go, what does this even mean? And it's clearly figurative. It's clearly a figure, a type of something. It represents something. And that is where people like Hal Lindsey and Tim LaHaye of the Left Behind series, people have written books and done talks and obviously movies. There was another series of movies on the Left Behind books too, with our buddy Kirk Cameron, which ended up being a dismal flop, ironically enough. Tim LaHaye actually sued the production company. I have to laugh about this over the first Left Behind movie because he said, you did a crap job. It wasn't what I had envisioned in my books. And so they rebooted it and did another one with Nicolas Cage, which was also shit. So that flopped as well. So the books were hugely successful, but the movies were dismal failures. They were just shit, so you have to laugh about that. Anyway, so Tim LaHaye, I'm so sad, so sorry for you, buddy. Your movies sucked. Your books were bestsellers, though. So here's these events that take place, and that's where guys like Hal Lindsey and Tim LaHaye have to start getting figurative. The book of Daniel, too, there's a whole section kind of in the middle or the last 2/3 of the book where it just gets friggin' bizarre. Flying goats, and you see things like beasts coming out of the sea with 3 heads and 10 eyes, and you're like, what the hell is it? Clearly it's not a real thing. But of course, when I was teaching the book of Revelation as a Bible college teacher, what I used to do with my students, I'd say, is it literal? And they'd pretty much all of them say, absolutely, yeah, we have to interpret it literally, yes. And I'd start showing images that I just found on Google image search where artists have tried to paint portraits and draw pictures of these beasts, these fantastical beasts that come out of the book of Revelation and Daniel. And you say, what the hell is that? A dragon, a lion, a goat. And they go into all these things. What does it even mean? If you try to draw them and paint them, what ends up happening, of course, is that you have no choice as an artist but to follow the depiction of what the text actually is saying. So you end up with a beast with 10 horns and 10 eyes, and you have to draw that. You end up with these bizarre, fantastical, weird beasts. Well, of course, it must be a type. So you go into all this stuff. Oh, it's the nations that come along, or it's the Antichrist, and the 10 horns represent 10 different nations or 10 different kings, and you have to say each one must represent something. It's typology. And where does it go? What does it represent? The city on the 7 hills, that's Rome. You see, there's 7 hills. And so somehow the Pope must be involved in bringing about the rise of the Antichrist, because this city in the 7 hills, that's got to be Rome. And what other power could do that, establish sort of a worldwide religion, help the Antichrist with a global economy? Well, it's got to be the Pope. So people have been saying for centuries that the Pope is somehow going to be, or if not be the Antichrist, help bring it about. So that's what I'm talking about. It's very difficult to interpret it literally, and that's where you run into trouble. The book rolls along fairly chronologically, and then bam, it just blows the whole thing up with some bizarre vision of these types, these weird creatures and beasts that come out. And I remember my professor, Dr. Sailhammer, when I was in seminary, he was talking on this subject of the problem. He said, when you're reading apocalyptic literature, people like Hal Lindsey and others, is they're reading the Bible, they're holding the Bible in one hand and they've got a newspaper in the other hand. In other words, they're reading current events back into the text. And so this is the problem that you end up having, is they're going, aha, this is happening in Israel right now today. Oh, it must be this prophecy in the book of Revelation. That's a literal thing. I remember going to see Hal Lindsey speak at our church in Seattle years and years and years ago. They had a week-long conference, actually, and couple of nights, they had a guy come in talking about creation versus evolution, and of course, evolution was all wrong, and it was evil, and it was of the devil, and creation was correct and true. And then they finished the week-long thing. They had Chuck Smith. He came in and talked about it. Then they had Hal Lindsey. He was the keynote speaker. I think it was on the Friday night. And the only thing I remember, I went to that because I was really into the Bible prophecy thing. The one thing I remembered about Hal Lindsey was he was going through the book of Ezekiel, and it talks about this final battle, and they have to relate it to Armageddon, this sort of final showdown between the forces of Jesus and God and the forces of the devil, satanic armies led by the devil himself and the Antichrist. They're all involved in it. And of course, Christ's armies win, and the flames of these weapons that were used in this battle, according to the book of Ezekiel, will burn for 7 years. Now, you light a tank on fire. You can't light a piece of metal on fire. You could blow up the diesel in the tank. It's going to burn for an hour maybe, or however much fuel's left, and then that's it. I mean, you can go all over the place. Even now, today, you go down to Normandy in France, and there are burned out, rusted out hulks of tanks, German and American and British tanks that fought in the Second World War, they didn't burn for 7 years. If a tank got hit by a shell, it blew it up and then, the fuel burned off and that was the end of it. But here's this guy, Hal Lindsey, trying to go, well, we've got to come up with a tank that burns for 7 years. And I remember him saying that the Russians, and this was back in the Cold War, so this would have been like late 80s, early 90s, still when the Cold War was going on between America and Russia. He said there's new evidence that's come out that the Russians are building a tank that's made out of compressed high-strength wood, and it's stronger than steel. So they're going to make a tank out of wood. And the interesting thing about this compressed wood that the Russians are now developing for their tanks and ships is that when you light it on fire, it'll burn for 7 years. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, that's amazing, Hal. 7 years. There you go. You got this prophecy. This is what Ezekiel must have been talking about. And, you have these flying grasshoppers in the book of Revelation. And I've heard Hal Lindsey again talking about, well, clearly John was seeing a helicopter. That's what he was seeing. He must have been seeing an Apache helicopter or a Hind Russian helicopter or something like that. Clearly a combat aircraft. But of course, being John in the first century, he wouldn't have known what that was. So he said, well, it's a flying grasshopper. That's all he could equate it to in his language. He wouldn't have known the word helicopter didn't exist at that time. So that's how they do it. They have to interpret sort of current things back into the text and say, well, yes, they were limited in their language, but they didn't know how to describe it. So that's what John was talking about when he said flying grasshoppers. It was helicopters or airplanes. So that's how they kind of get around doing the literal interpretation of a clearly apocalyptic text. And it's funny because in the movie A Thief in the Night, I think it might be the second one, A Distant Thunder, they encounter these horrific beasts that John describes in the book of Revelation. But you can see how it creates a problem for Dotton as to how to portray these things, because of course he's going to interpret it literally. These are literal creatures that are going to exist someday. And this is what Dotton has to do. He has to take the text literally, but then that of course creates a bind for him because he clearly didn't have the budget to do these things and portray them as they're described in Revelation. The book of Revelation says there's going to be these flying creatures. And in fact, it describes them in Revelation chapter 9. So I'll describe these beasts to you as the text puts it. This is in the chronology of these various judgments and starts off with these various trumpets that come out from heaven, and these judgments fall, and each one gets worse and worse and worse. So after the fifth trumpet is sounded, these locusts come out of this pit, and they descend on the earth. And what it says in Revelation 9, it says they can sting people, but only the people who don't have God's seal. So there are people apparently in the tribulation that are safe. But when you get stung by this scorpion, you don't die. You're only tormented for 5 months. It's like the sting of a scorpion. And it says in verse 7, the locusts look like horses prepared for battle. So they have the body of a horse with something like crowns of gold on their heads and faces like the faces of men. They had hair like that of women, teeth like that of lions. They had thoraxes, which is a breastplate, the chest like breastplates of iron. The sound of their wings was the sound of many horses and chariots rushing into battle. They had tails with stingers like scorpions, which had the power to injure people for 5 months. And you can see right away that this is a problem for Dotton because you have to take this literally. This clearly cannot be a flying helicopter, but what does he do with it? What does this thing even look like? And again, do it yourself. Go on Google. Just do a search on Revelations, creatures, biblical end times. You'll see there's artists who tried to draw and paint and depict these bizarre looking creatures. Now, what happened in the second movie, I think it was, as these people were hiding out, these scorpion creatures, these flying creatures come, and apparently Dotton didn't have the budget to actually make it, and this is before CGI. This would have been late 70s, early 80s, and obviously he could have built a scale model, something like, one of those old 1950s horror films, a big rubber creature with people inside of it to make it move, but that would have been very expensive too, and it would have looked pretty hokey. So what he did was, when they were hiding in this cave, this flying scorpion, bizarre creature, that you only see the shadow of it on the cave wall, but it's stuck in them, and one of the people does get stung by this horrific creature. But again, he has to take it literally. And see, that's my point, is that he believes these creatures They are literal, exactly as the book of Revelation describes them, some funky, bizarre creature with a, tail of a scorpion, like a locust, and it flies, and it's got a woman's hair and a man's face. I mean, just what the hell? But he's got to, you see, and that's the thing. And what's interesting about the movies, as the 4 movies progress, he has an increasingly hard time carrying the narrative line through of these people who have been left behind. And in the end, in the final movie, I don't want to give the spoiler alert away, but it's almost like this apocalyptic, where these survivalists are standing up against this one world order, and they crack the computer code that's controlling everybody, and they blow up their headquarters. And you're like, well, what's the point of that? It's descended into farce. It's descended into nothing more than sort of like a dystopian end times movie. If you've ever seen that movie, The Road, that's a similar kind of thing. What happens when society breaks down? Or The Postman, that's another movie where, world descends into chaos after nuclear war, and it's every person for themselves, and it's chaos, and it's this horrible dystopian thing where people are eating each other and there's mutants running around. Well, Doughton wasn't about to be outdone. By the 3rd or 4th movie, he's got mutants running around his hellscape too. So there you go. It just becomes an absolute farce, and so it just gets he's having such a hard time carrying the narrative, the plot through to the very end. He doesn't know where to end it. So what happens when they blow up the headquarters of this thing? What then? So it just gets, like I said, just descends into farce. It's complete and utter farce, but he's forced to stay on that literalist interpretation line right the way through all 4 movies. Maybe he would have been better off doing the first 2 and leaving it at that. But of course, you can't leave the listeners hanging. You can't leave the viewers hanging. So Doughton had to produce all 4 films and trace the whole thing through, as ridiculous and farcical as it got. But people are incurably fascinated by this topic of how the world is going to end and how it's all going to go down. In fact, I remember when the Left Behind books were coming out, I can't remember, it might have been every 2 or 3 years. I don't know how long it was. I never read this series, but when they were coming out, my neighbor, when we were living in near Portland, Oregon, years and years ago, Bruce was his name. He was not a Christian. Somehow somebody turned him on to the very first book. My God, this man was absolutely fascinated by the Left Behind books. And we would talk about it because, of course, at the time I was the pastor of a church in Portland. So he was always asking me questions about what happens next, what happens in the chronology. And he could not wait for the next book in the series to drop. And he would pre-order at the bookstore. This was before Amazon and all that. He would have his book ready and waiting for him the second it came into print. He would go down and queue up in front of the bookstore and get the next Left Behind book. So there is something to this thing of biblical prophecy, end times prophecy. People have this desire. They want to know, how's it going to all end? How's it going to go down? And the Bible's got all the answers, doesn't it? And therefore, for people like Russell S. Doughton, Tim LaHaye, and others who get into this stuff of the end times prophecy, they certainly believe that that's the case. And that's what drives them to do what it is they're doing. So I don't know if that's helped you. I've kind of rambled on a little bit here and there, but these are my thoughts. These are kind of how I've approached this thing now. I'm seeing, as I say now, as an adult, I can look back on it and hopefully looking at this sort of child rearing philosophy, what would drive a parent to bring a young child to a church service in which they show movies like this? Well, they're hoping to scare them straight, scare them away from hell. And so they think they're doing all the right things for all the right reasons. God is not only going to be not upset with them, he's actually going to bless them if I, as a young child, and see, that's the whole thing. The movie had the desired effect. Off the back of watching that film, I came to my parents, I came to my pastor, and I said, I don't want to get left behind in the rapture. I need to get saved. This is something that Chris Shelton and I talk about in the podcast, where I said, look, I don't want to miss it. I am absolutely terrified, traumatized. Of course, I didn't say that, but I said, I don't want to go to hell. I don't want to have to face the tribulation. And then they said, well, you got to get baptized. And it went down that line, which, of course, in their theology, it was baptismal regeneration. So every time it didn't take, I just went around and got baptized again and ended up getting baptized 3 times because I was, again, so terrified, at least the first 2, that I wasn't really a Christian. I was nothing more than a self-deluded hypocrite. and I was going to miss the rapture and be left behind. So in addition to the first two baptisms, for that reason, I rededicated my life to Christ hundreds, if not thousands of times. I prayed the sinner's prayer almost nightly because I just wanted to make sure that I didn't miss the rapture, because it could happen, as the movie says, like a thief in the night, breaking in when the homeowner least expects the thief to come in. They come in and you don't know, and it's too late. You can't put bars on the window then. The thief's already in the house and it's too late, and it's all over. And that's the whole point of the movie. That's the whole point of why they did it. But of course, a conversion that's coerced, and this is what I talk about in my podcast on the psychology of conversion, a conversion that is manipulated and coerced through terror tactics. First of all, it's not even real. And second, it's traumatizing. It's deeply traumatic. And this is this issue of rapture anxiety and religious abuse and religious trauma and all these other sorts of things. And you have to wonder, what sort of God is this? What sort of God wants to have people enter into his heaven through fear tactics and fear mongering and being frightened literally to death? And what kind of a God throws all these horrific judgments down on people? And there's this sense of like a self-satisfied thing of these Christians that go around saying, well, I used to say it when I was a Christian, well, I read the end of the book and we win in the end. And there's this sort of smug, condescending attitude. And you go, what kind of a God are these evangelicals serving? I know I didn't really get much into that in this episode, but hopefully it's made you kind of think, maybe I need to deconstruct some of these views and questions around this topic of God himself. What kind of a God does the Bible actually portray? That is pretty deeply disturbing. At any rate, I'm just going to leave that there, and you can send me your thoughts and questions on this topic of the God piece of this whole thing as well. I hope that's helped you kind of unpack it, at least from a narratological point of view, to kind of understand how the whole thing works. You've got a guy who's interpreting the Bible, literally creating this narrative world, this universe, as it were, and then we enter into it as viewers. So the question is, do you buy the theology, the interpretation? It's one man's interpretation, and then he's just running on that line all the way through all four movies to the bitter end, even as farcical as it gets. So hopefully that's helped you kind of think these things through. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion of a lot of topics, all the way from fundamentalist child rearing to a thief in the night to narratology and the book of Revelation and some of the other issues that arise with biblical prophecy. So thanks for joining me on this bonus episode. I hope you've gotten something out of it. If you have, I'd love to hear your stories. That's what I'm interested in, talking to people who survived things like the Gothard cult and who survived things like this rapture anxiety. That's an actual hashtag. If you go on Twitter, type in hashtag rapture anxiety, you'll see that. And you can read my story, as I say, on Medium. And I think a lot of people, I've heard from people already who have identified with my story. And so hopefully this has kind of helped to unpack a little bit about what's going on in the movie A Thief in the Night and then the other three movies that came after it. Thanks for joining me on this apocalyptic hellscape journey through the movie A Thief in the Night. I hope it's helped you deal with some of your rapture anxiety. I'll see you again. Take care.